So I was just browsing today's news when this article from The Independent caught my eye, just for the sheer mental gymnastics that the writer has had to go through to come to their conclusions. I'll preface this by saying it is an opinion piece, and online that takes zero effort, but is The Independent going to become the new Guardian? We'll have to wait and see now, won't we? The article is titled How Leaders Like Boris Johnson Took Toxic Masculinity in Politics to Terrifying New Heights. Obvious allusion to Trump, of course, although I wouldn't be surprised if they're trying to lump in everyone from Viktor Orban to Bolsonaro in there as well, even though they're incomparable. Terrifying new heights to the patriarchal, toxic masculinity as well, more terrifying than somewhere like Turkey, North Korea, India, Saudi Arabia, to name but a few, where laws can be found preventing women from driving without supervision, incarceration for 3 generations for infidelity, the lashing of women for being uncovered. Okay, so mean words are the height of misogynistic toxicity for you, Lords Walsh, is it? Let's go on. From Churchill to Putin, Thatcher to Merkel, masculine traits have long been perceived as evidence of competent leadership. We like our politicians to be strong, assertive and unwavering in the face of discord and conflict. It is a cultural norm that pervades not only those in power, but which also infiltrates the psyche of our society, most notably among men. Strong, assertive, unwavering in the face of discord and conflict. Strength being in the eye of the beholder. Would you prefer a weak leader? Someone with some sort of wasting terminal illness, perhaps? Instead of being assertive, they could capitulate to every demand made of them by the opposition. And instead of forging on through discord and conflict to fight for, in the context of today, the fulfilment of the democratic mandate of the British people, instead they could be frightened by the idea of coming into verbal conflict with people whose ideas are so antithetical to their own. Case in point, Jeremy Corbyn, a hardcore socialist who believes that in the wake of a crisis, we should seize private property from people who are above his arbitrary rich people line and give it to those without, all whilst centralising the economy, and we'll pair them up against someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg, a Catholic conservative who believes in a limited government, free market, charitable solutions and keeping a constrained budget. These two people are never going to get along politically due to the polar opposite ways that they see the world, and there can and will be very little or no compromise that can be made between them because their lenses are so separated. The harmful ways in which the patriarchy constrains men is thought to be a dominant factor behind a rise in male suicide. During 2018, the number of people who died by suicide in the UK rose by almost 12%, with men 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women. So now you've managed to make men's higher rate of suicide men's fault, especially by pointing to your concept of original sin in the patriarchy. It has nothing to do with the fact that men have a grand total of 20 refuge beds nationwide for men attempting to escape domestic violence, despite the figures suggesting, even from radical left-wing sources like The Guardian here, that men make up approximately 40% of domestic violence statistics. That's 0.8% of all refuge beds, by the way, none of which happen to be in London, interestingly enough. Do you think that men failing to find meaning in their lives through the primary way that they do find meaning, i.e. forming lasting bonds with other men and stable long-term relationships with women due to the changing landscape of today's society, is somehow men's fault? I'll come back to this. The gendered expectations which promote emotional repression and stigma are nowhere more visible than in our current Prime Minister's misogynistic language and behaviours. Boris Johnson unashamedly referred to a peer as a girly swat recently, though not for the first time. Not only do his words highlight his sexist views, they also amplify the competitive alpha dominance and the social expectation on men to assert aggression as often as possible. I'd say that first of all, Boris is not emotionally repressed at all, given that he seems to be honestly expressing himself without a thought for what anyone else thinks. At least that's honest. I'm not the biggest Johnson fan, I wouldn't call his comment tasteful, however anyone can see that politics is a game of dominance. It's a power play, so of course, him being Prime Minister and all, he is going to have elements of a dominating, aggressive personality. As for the term girly swat, I believe this was in a private note to his long-term rival David Cameron, and is essentially calling him a childish, fragile nerd, for those who don't know what a swat is. The writer's inability to distinguish between little girls and grown women in the insult shows the bad faith this article is written in the first place. Girls are not strong. Boys are not strong. Men and women can be with the right personality traits and disposition, but children generally are not. I don't think anyone's going to call me out on that. He may as well have called Cameron sarcastically a studious little boy. Girl just has more bite because, of course, Cameron isn't one. Even as new campaigns such as the NHS's Every Mind Matters aims to promote the idea that poor mental health in all its camouflaged manifestations is to be understood and treated, the overt display of machismo fuels a culture of stoicism and self-reliance. Terrible. This in turn deters men from reaching out for professional help, leaving them floundering in a world mired in stereotypes and gender conformity. Stoicism and self-reliance are a part of growing up. Everyone needs at least a fraction of self-reliance to function. Lean on your friends and trusted colleagues, sure, but the challenges we face in life, though threadbare today compared to history, require iron. They require grit. They require leaning in. It's nothing to crow about to claim that you aren't self-reliant. Men don't seek professional help because the ways men interact are fundamentally different to the ways women interact. In terms of sexual selection, men compete and they chase, women compete and are chased. This turns every single multi-sex arena, as it were, into a potential sexual competition for men. It's why the decrease in male-only spaces is a bad thing, because, like it or not, the introduction of even a single woman to a male space will change the dynamic. Men do open up to each other, around other men, close male friends, usually down the pub or at the gym or wherever. Any woman is potentially a viable sexual partner to men, like it or not, that's biology, so whilst men may open up to a single woman at a time, if there are men present, it's not going to happen. The usual response from current society is, deal with it. That's a consequence of progressivism, not patriarchy, and not everyone needs a therapist. Mockery as medicine is beginning to be phased out. We have a greater awareness of language and its impact. No longer are phrases like man up, boys don't cry, and boys will be boys acceptable in our playgrounds. Our future society will undoubtedly be better off for it. But as children shun the codes of colours and language, toys and aspirations, while peers and leaders scoff at political correctness and human rights, for the grown men struggling now navigating this world is desolate and isolating. No, mockery as a medicine is not beginning to be phased out. Banter is being crushed by people who don't understand banter. Light mockery normalises the differences between people and is the equivalent of the relationship shit test that women put men through, but between men. Britain in particular has always been known for its self-deprecatory and scathingly sarcastic humour. Phasing that out makes people weaker, not stronger. In fact, I believe it was Jordan Peterson who mentioned that a study of people who had engaged in rough and tumble play as a child and those who hadn't, revealed that those who hadn't lacked the capacity to distinguish between a real fight and a play fight. The same is true of language. There are those who lack the capacity to see a jibe as anything other than a personal attack, or a joke as a personal attack, or a bit of banter as something other than someone testing out another person's boundaries, weaknesses, level-headedness, and their humour, of course. When it comes to kids and the toys, are they, though? Gender expression is still a bimodally distributed spectrum, with 95+% of the population presenting masculine or feminine correlated with their assigned sex at birth. There are forums filled with complaining progressive parents about how little Timmy just kept going back to his trucks no matter how many dolls the parents put in front of him. Political correctness is a cancer that threatens real dialogue, and human rights are not additive. They are only negative. You do not have the right to anything, only from things. What you define as human rights laws are probably not what is codified as human rights in law, nor what most of the country would define as human rights. But moving on. For generations, the toxic belief that work and lifestyle should be split along gender lines has informed the social norms men must practice in order to be identified as male. This division has been countered by moves towards equality. Well, first of all, before we get into that, in the social norms men must practice in order to be identified as male, these go two ways. These are instantiated not just by men, but by the women who are attracted to men. There are women out there, feminists, I hate to break it to you, who are very attracted to the traditional man, and it's a lot of them, which is why only 7% of the UK identifies as feminist. Anyway, this division has been countered by moves towards equality from proportional representation in traditionally perceived male professions. Proportional representation. So you mean increase gender quotas for women because you believe that they're too weak to compete on male merit. Disentangling ourselves from the perceived weakness of collaboration has proven benefits emotionally and economically. With the dismantling of the patriarchy, so too men are liberated. First of all, it's not a toxic belief. It's biological reality. Women got pregnant, they got pregnant young because mortality was high, because the pill was not invented or distributed until the 60s, and because it was safest for women in the industrial and pre-industrial world physically to survive by not working the coal mines, by not working in manufacturing, by not fighting the wars, by not ploughing the fields. And you will notice that some women, despite this, still rose to become respected leaders, monarchs, business owners, but it took an especially determined woman to do it. It's usually at the cost of a family, unless you were a royal. I'm thinking people like Ada Lovelace, Boadicea and others. Because mortality was high and women died in childbirth, women were more valuable than men and treated accordingly. Do I think the emancipation of women has been a positive for society? Of course I do. As technology advances and takes the biological pressures off women, they should be free to do as they choose. That's whether that's start a family or work a job. What it doesn't mean is that it was merely the combined willpower of all evil men that kept women in the situation of housewife. For Johnson, though, it seems the notion of political cooperation is still viewed as a deficiency, a sacrifice of his own manhood. The idea of collaboration is treated with disdain, and requesting a reprieve in the Brexit negotiations in the form of an extension has Johnson balking, even if it costs him his job. This self-destructive stance is synonymous with toxic masculinity, the male ego at once fragile and immovable. Well, the first bit of that's because all of Parliament is against him, isn't it? It's because the Parliament of Brexit, one which should be stacked with levers, supporting the democratic mandate of the people, the thing which we voted for, the thing which won the Tories the last election, is against him. Boris has to fight every single step of the way against the Remain crowd. As for the idea of collaboration being treated with disdain, that's incorrect as well. Johnson has attempted to do nothing but collaborate in his dealings with the EU stonewalling him and refusing every compromise he puts on the table without detailing what their problems with those compromises are is not the sign of a weak and toxic man. You've managed to snooker yourself with your own definition of toxic masculinity, by the way, with this dissonance of, oh, how fragile he is, and yet how immovable he appears to be. What kind of nonsense is that? A no-deal Brexit looks reckless, but repeated warnings of economic crises are ignored. Concession and compromise are shunned, and risk-taking is heroic, as long as men are the ones taking the risks. The white and wealthy historically hold little liability, yet from this viewpoint the strong and stable look stunted and insecure. As long as men are taking the risks. Need I remind you of Margaret Thatcher and the risks that she took? She wasn't called the Iron Lady by both her proponents and detractors alike for no reason. Not to mention the piss-poor performance of a certain Theresa May, who did nothing but avoid risk, compromise, and fail in her duty to the British people. Side note, don't bring your bloody racial politics into this arena, Independent. They are not the white and the wealthy, they are the British and the wealthy. No deal looks reckless because it is, for both sides, which is why in the wake of a no-deal Brexit, looking ever likelier by the day due to Brussels' obstinance, new deals will need to be forged to save an ailing Germany, France and Italy through continued trade with a Great Britain freed from the shackles of EU legislation. The last part of the article basically glorifies Corbyn as a soft-spoken, well-meaning opiate of the youth. It claims he wanted to see peace and compromise through the troubles in the north of Ireland, and this makes him weak in the eyes of traditional masculinity. It should be obvious, as it is to anyone with half a nick of common sense, that this is utter trollop. Jeremy Corbyn sought to compromise as much as possible with the terrorists in the IRA, with his friends in Hezbollah and Hamas, and further afield. In so doing, negotiating in good faith with groups that are negotiating in bad faith that only see him as a useful idiot. The kinds of people who know that he will give them good press by attempting to reframe acts of terror as a holy crusade of sorts, and who will refuse to denounce the atrocities they commit. He is nothing except weak. If that's your idea of a strong man to lead Britain, Miss Walsh, then I kindly invite you to witness this mid-digit and spin on it.